Welcome to a new solo show. There's a little saying amongst the old rock and rollers, less is more. And I wanted to sort of focus on that a little bit today because there is definitely something in the creative process about limiting and limitation. And we do tend to overcomplicate things. And it seems the most effective way, in my experience, to question whether you need something, whether you need extra words, whether you need extra equipment, whether you can reduce the number of notes in a melody. Does it improve it? Can you reduce the number of chords even? And, the question is, does that improve things? And in my experience, it generally does. Over the past several years, I've focused on this idea with a little group that I run on Saturday mornings. And I've explored these possibilities with a couple of very creative lads. And we've looked at restricting options and deconstructing ideas, cutting back to define the essence of what it was that we were doing, with some exciting results, particularly in our way of thinking. And I've looked at situations historically where people have been limited, sometimes with what's available, because of things like wartime rationing is a good example of this, where people's health improved. Sort of counterintuitive, there wasn't much to eat, but people's health improved. So, you can see the opposite of that now, of course, can't you? Where there's an abundance of food, even if we can't get tomatoes at the moment, there's an abundance of food, and yet people are distinctly unwell. And, the restriction of things because of poverty actually increases people's capacity to solve problems. And in the art world, it definitely boosts creativity if you limit what you've got available. Now, a couple of years ago, I interviewed Billy Childish, the artist, one of the Stuckists, and Bill's got this thing of limitation and primitiveness being part of the creative process. And I completely agree with him on this. Once you limit yourself to what you're doing, it sort of focuses the mind in a particular way. Bill's got this thing about, even with the sort of punk music that he plays, it's all about limitation. And I really get that. I really think that works well. And even in podcasting, I found that this is such a good solution to things. And when people sort of ask me about podcasting because they want to get involved, that is definitely one of the things I say to them. Don't spend a load of money on equipment, for God's sake. Start off simple. Do the interviews on Zoom or Skype and use whatever you got, whether that's a phone, iPad, laptop. Don't go out and buy a load of expensive gear. That's actually advice for people starting a business. Get what it is that needs to be done, and do it with as simply as you can. Because I just use elementary editing stuff, which I've used for years, and it works fine. Because the problem, and success is always is not predicated on equipment. It's predicated on having a good idea. It's predicated on answering a need or solving a problem for people, right? And that's really what it's about. It's not about getting equipment to give you the edge. I mean, that's nonsense, really. The edge is really all about the message, getting the message right. So when I put the notes together for this podcast, I was out walking, and I used my phone and dictated notes into the phone. Now, this is another thing I really like. It's sort of like misappropriation of equipment. You know, it's a phone, so use it as a dictaphone. Use things for things other than what they're primarily designed for. I think is a great idea. Mixing different types of tech, you know, write things longhand, and then if you have to dictate them into your phone to get things in a printable format or whatever, it's sort of misappropriation of technology is good. The interesting thing is actually about this, the SMS was just an extra add-on to phones, and they didn't really think it was going to catch on because they had pages before that, you know, where you'd phone somebody up or send them to get a message to somebody, like some sort of operator who would pass a message on onto a pager. And that sort of went out of fashion as if it wasn't a good idea. But obviously, text messaging is like fabulously good. And so it goes to show that sort of technology is brilliant for creativity. But again, it's being used on a phone, which is not really what the phone was designed to do. Well, it is, you know, you get it's not its main function. And if you think about the great developments of musical instruments and stuff like that, or great players, they're often doing something in a slightly different way from the accepted technique, if you see what I mean. So you can see that's worth checking that out. So it's like sort of disrupting technology instead of it just being disruptive technology. Okay, so I think this is a good way forward to rethink how something's used. And in that way, there may be some stuff that you would just throw away because it's old, but there might be another use for it. I mean, sometimes things are just good for firewood, if you see what I mean. And in that way, there is another use for it. I've done some podcast interviews about foraging, which is primarily about how it changes your way of seeing things. I would say this is definitely a thing for this as well. You know, reducing what you're doing to improve it, but also reassigning ideas as well. Okay. When I was working on the cover, well, the book's not completely finished yet, but the artwork for the front is done. When we were actually looking at this, so the book is called Music, Magic and NLP. Andrea, who's the artist dealing with the artwork for the cover, who's an excellent artist, came up with some fabulous ideas from my original plan. And she was using pictures of my guitars, pictures of equipment that I use, pictures of clothing that I use on stage, and pictures of friends of mine. And obviously these are tied into the storylines of the book. So we were sort of restructuring the original image of Sergeant Pepper so that it was different and it was new and it wouldn't sort of conflict with any copyright issues. But we use things like photocopying and photographing, and then sort of cutting these things down, reshaping them, and then adding Andrew's drawings into things. So there was a real mix of sort of old technology and ultimately new technology because of the way that the book's going to be produced. And it sort of created really an exciting image. And so, you know, I could have used some sort of off-the-shelf bit of artwork for the cover. But the whole point of the project was that the work itself would give people ideas about the creativity, not just about what's written in the book, but the whole concept of the book itself. So when you saw it, you could see it was work in progress, and you could see how I'd taken the idea from the original sort of Sergeant Pepper with the track listing and all the rest of it, and see how that grew into a separate idea. Now, there's obviously a web page that links to the book, and the idea of that is that it gives further detail, and I could then continue to grow the idea online. So the book also becomes a portal to other ideas, podcast interviews, links to other items that I see that's relevant to the book, and then just so that book continues to grow, but not necessarily materially. And I think obviously that's a pretty cool way of doing things. You can see this with things like Facebook groups, how that something could morph into something else. And so the idea of, again, that's reappropriating the idea of, a website or whatever to do those things. The initial idea is actually really very simple, which is it's just a bunch of ideas about creativity. I'm not saying that they always work, but they could well work for you. And it's not really about what I've done, it's about what you can do. So in that way, you don't really need to say very much to convince people. And I'm certainly not one of these people who writes something like, I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell you, and then I tell you what I'm going to tell you, and then I'm going to tell you what I've told you, type of attitude that often happens with books. For me, it's like, I'll tell you the thing and just go and do it, and then see what happens, which is more akin to sort of throwing a grenade into a room and seeing what happens. So some of the ideas maybe going against the potential impact of AI. So what I'm thinking here is going back to the fundamentals of our humanness. Now, this is an interesting point because the creative process is going to be essential to where we are, considering that really our left brain is going to be left completely behind on this. That's probably why it's called the left brain. The right side of the brain, this is, okay, I get this, the way, things are, the way the brain works, it's not just in one area, but you get the concept, right? That part of the brain is that dreamlike, slightly unstructured, and in some cases utterly amorphous nature of the dreaming, which is really central to consciousness, but certainly absolutely pivotal to do with creativity. And that's absolutely deeply part of what we are. But I would also say that may be what is deeply part of the nature of the consciousness of nature itself. Maybe trees dream in a particular way, animals dream in a particular way. I don't know, but I'm just sort of putting that out there, that might be something nearer to what consciousness is really about. But this actually makes us fall back on our ability to conjure ideas. So I use that word in its magical sense as well. From the natural world through our thoughts. So we're bringing forward something new in such a way that we've always done it. We take something, reappropriate the idea, and it's often very simple. I often use this idea about, the spider's web being used to catch fish. We appropriate an idea. It's a very simple idea. We don't necessarily need to know how a spider builds a web, but it's the concept that's simple, and we take that and put that somewhere else, okay, in order to catch fish. Now, we've always done this. We've done things for marking objects with symbols. Again, this is the idea of being able to encapsulate a complex idea and being able to make it very simple, making it less. And then, that's that same concept that we do the drawing and painting of cave walls, down to the formulating of language through marks and pictures. And that really sets us apart from other creatures. But at its essence, it's about simplification. If you know about symbols that represent something, it's the way that we map things. It's the way that we manage to show patterns and simplify it into a form that we can grasp really complex ideas. Maybe this is really fundamental to the idea of magical thinking. Now, I use this a lot because it's about the chaos magic aspect of being able to push probability in your favour. So occasionally you get sort of miraculous things happen. Not often, but sometimes you do. And you do in life anyway, don't you? The strange phone call that comes out of the blue that sets you up for a new area of your life. Okay? But generally speaking, things that are in play at the moment, they're the ones that, if the probability is pushed in your favour, that's a good move, right? But it's happening in a physical environment. It's that thing that sets an athlete, because the difference between a bronze and a gold is small, right? If you're looking at it that way. And those little incremental differences make a vast difference. So sometimes those little ideas, simple ideas, not complex ideas, simple ideas can have profound implications. So even with systems like mathematics and drawings, stories, we can explain the world in such a way where we can manipulate things, and it all comes down to simplifying the world around us. So in other words, less.